Hello everyone, this is Genius Yoshi, and today we're going to be doing something a little different. I've pre-built here a standard Ruby Amethyst list, like the ones that's been taking down tournaments all over the world, crowned the king of the metagame. And what we're gonna do is figure out its weaknesses, and also figure out why it's so good by analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of the deck. But first, let's start by going through the list and seeing what's in that infamous Ruby Amethyst. The deck typically plays 6 to 8 1-drops, all the vanilla 1-3s, so the Minnie Mouse, always classy, and Olaf friendly snowman. Here I choose to play 7, kind of a middle ground. The deck also plays 4 copies of Madam and Snake and Madam and Fox, which I'm sure you've seen bouncing around all over the metagame and bouncing their characters. So Madam and Snake, just overgrown stats, and Madam and Fox is a replacement for Rafiki, for those who remember just the original set, but she's inkable, she hits for 4, she hits fast, and she can get extra value. Titan Ambition, the removal spell of choice, deals 2 damage to one of your characters and one of your opponents, friends on the other side. Add 4 copies, 3 Maleficents, 2 Merlins, 4 minis. Here I'm playing the one of Sorcerer's Spellbook, kind of as a tech, and so we get to talk about the card. A lot of Merlins. Here I choose to play 3 Rabbits because it's uninkable. Maui's, Lady Tremaines, Isma. Some Be Prepareds, 2 Ursulas, 1 Elsa, and 4 copies of Maleficent. Alright, so that pretty much covers the list. Now my first question would be, why so many 1-drops? Why are we playing Minnie Mouse and Olaf? So there's a couple of different reasons. One, by having the 1-drops, it allows you to use either Madam Mins and put them into play with a very cheap cost. You can quest with Minnie, bounce her back in hand with Madam and Snake, or play the Fox, and you just get them out in the early game, and you get these overstats character on the board early, which is pretty good. Then there's Titan Ambition, which allows you to deal 2 damage to one of your characters to ping one of the opponent's character for 2. And Titan Ambition allows this deck to keep control over these pesky Pinocchio questers for 3, or the Lilos and Maleficents, the 1-drop, that these aggro decks are playing. So having access to 1-3s, you kind of stonewall these decks, and Titan Ambition allows you to snipe whatever cheap characters they're playing, or 2 willpower characters, while keeping your 1-drop alive to then bounce it back with a Madam Min. So the 1-drops play very well with the Madam Mins, play very well with the Titan Ambition, and play very well with Merlin the Crab. So Merlin the Crab has twice the ability to give one character plus 3 power. And suddenly, you've turned a 1-drop into a high-powered removal spell, which is very good. You're getting a lot of value out of these 1-drops just by having the synergy with these 4 cards. Not to mention that they provide you this early game sturdy presence, and later in the game they're inkable. And this deck wants to ink a lot to get to the top end of its curve. And with that in mind, that's why the deck is playing so many 1-drops. The other reason why they're playing the 3 willpower 1-drops is because of some other cards that are very present in the metagame, and early on with Rise of the Floodborn were quite scary and oppressive. One of those cards is Let the Storm Rage On, especially in combination with Cinderella, Ballroom Dancer. It will allow for the Amber Steel decks to simply snipe whatever character you put on the board that has 2 willpower, and draw a card, and cast it for essentially free. And that gave the Amber Steel decks just a lot of pressure in the metagame, and forced Ruby Amethyst into these 1-3s, which essentially laugh in the face of Let the Storm Rage On. And if we look at our Ruby Amethyst list, we'll notice that almost every card has at least 3 willpower. Another card that we're avoiding is Grab Your Sword, the one-sided deadly song that, again, Amber Steel would play, that would just one-side board wipe half of your team and deal heavy damage to the rest. Well, again, most of our characters have 3 willpower. What do we care? We can see them here. The only thing that has 2 willpower is this Maleficent. That's already paid for itself with a card. Okay, so that explains the 3 willpower, which is also a weakness that we can exploit. Knowing that the deck is playing around all of these 2 damage spells, cards like Smash or 3 powered 2-drops suddenly become a lot more important if we go to try and counter that Ruby Amethyst deck. Let's put that on hold for now and continue analyzing the strengths and card choices of the deck. So the Crab, very good. Repeatability with the mana mins, awesome. This Merlin Rabbit is a card draw on a stick. It's worth by itself 2 cards, but if you have a mana min to play with it, then suddenly it's worth 2 free cards, and you got your mana min in play. Okay, you did pay the 4 for the rabbit, so you're spending a lot of time drawing the cards by using the Merlin Rabbit and then bouncing it back. But if you play a Merlin Rabbit, then sing Friends on the other side with it, bounce it back with a mana min, you've accrued a lot of resources, a lot of cards. And between the Maleficent, the Merlin Rabbit, the Friends on the other side, and the bouncing effects, you're almost guaranteed to get a mid full of cards. And then you can keep on inking stuff to reach the later stages of the game. So Ruby Amethyst has this fairly oppressive early game, or a fairly defensive one, where they have these mana mins, they have these 1-drops to keep the pressure, they have the Crab that can allow you to punch a little bit above your weight, and then you turn into card draw value town. One of the cards that Ruby Amethyst plays is the Stylish Surfer Minnie Mouse, a 1/3 evasive threat that quests for 2. So one of the weaknesses of the control decks and in Lorcana in general is that it's very hard to prevent someone from questing. You need to either destroy the character on the spot or have some questing prevention effect. And these are rare and expensive effects. So one of the weaknesses of Ruby Amethyst is that it just couldn't keep on dealing with all the threats that the opponent would put out. So you have to end the game eventually. So what Ruby Amethyst is doing now is applying pressure and threatening the opponent so that the opponent can't just sit back, play big threats, and wait until your Ruby Amethyst runs out of resources or gets so far in late game that he can keep on dropping Maleficent Dragons over and over again, which is still a possibility with this list. But Minnie Mouse applies pressure. Minnie Mouse is evasive, she's hard to remove, she has that magical 3 willpower, so she can't let the storm rage on. It needs to be a double tick or a tick and Tinkerbell, something like that. But she's a fast clock and needs to be respected. We then move on to the top end of the curve, which is where Ruby Amethyst is the scariest and where it's always really been the scariest. If you can make it to the big dragons, you've probably won. Well, lost as the opponent, won as the Ruby Amethyst, because, man, that dragon hits like a truck. And what's worse is that if the Ruby Amethyst deck has enough cards, you can bounce it back with a mana min and keep it going for one more round of single target removal off of the big bad dragon. Ruby Amethyst also has the very powerful Be Prepared. And this is probably the key card of the deck. Not necessarily because it's really good, but because the opponent has to respect it. The opponent is stuck between a rock and a hard place. If they overcommit to the board and play a lot of stuff, be prepared, board wipe, and I have card advantage, I'm going to oppress you and win the game. If you don't go with many characters and you just try to play 1 or 2 threats, well, guess what? We have a perfect answer for that too with Lady Tremaine, Imperious Queen, which preys on these decks that only have 1 strong character on the board. She just said, You gotta sacrifice it, and, well, you have a 2-quester with decent stats left on the board. So, between Lady Tremaine and Be Prepared, the deck is just very well equipped to deal with whatever board is presented in front of them. Then there's Maui. So between Maui and Madame Mim, the deck is really good at taking out these exerted characters through combat with their just high stats level. And Maui is just a notorious removal spell that sticks on the board after its job is done, and he pressures the opponent into not questing, which allows you to reach that top end of the curve. Isma can be played both ways. You can eat your 1-drops, yet another use for these 1-drops. Eat them for 2 cards, or take down a dangerous threat and, well, yeah, concede a little bit of card advantage to the opponent until you get to your higher end threats. Then the deck has been playing Ursula's and Elsa. Elsa, just awesome at exerting opponent's characters, but the deck has to be a bit careful because between the Be Prepared, the Lady Tremaines, and the Ursula Elsa, it's a lot of high-costed uninkables. Thankfully, the deck makes up for it with the amount of other inkable cards and the amount of card draw in the deck. So it isn't much of a problem and almost guarantees that you're going to hit one of these heavy hitters in the mid to late game. Ursula has been seeing a bit more favor lately, probably because of her cheaper ink cost. The fact that she's still a very big threat, quest for 3, replaces herself with card advantage, drains 1 lore from the opponent. It's just a series of effects that's very good with this deck, with solid stats, and it's cheaper than Elsa, which is one of the main reasons to play her over the Spirit of Winter over here. Just shiny and brilliant, doing great work as usual. So the deck has a strong early game plan, strong early removal, decent pressure in the mid game with the mini, and while still generating huge amounts of card advantage with the rabbit friends on the other side and the bouncing here and there from Madame Mins into more control and very disruptive, powerful cards. And Ursula, Elsa, and Maleficent do quest for a lot. Actually, Lady Tremaine too. So with the pressure from a mini and you land a Lady Tremaine, you're suddenly on a very fast clock, and Ruby Amethyst can close out these games. It doesn't go into this back and forth of removal spells and you're getting to turn 50 and then you're realizing, if I've been drawing 2 cards a turn and turn 50, I should have run out of cards 10 turns ago. But small details. The deck also likes to play occasionally Sorcerer's Spellbook as another inevitable source of lore. Also, it's one of the few cards in the game that give you lore on the turn that it's played. Same thing with the Merlin's Goat. You can get a lot of value. You can force gaining some lore. Again, applying some of that inevitable pressure on the opponent. The Goat's really good because it can then do a combat and still gain a lore out of it. So act as a control-ish card, or you can bounce it and replay it to gain a bit more lore. The option's all yours. And this deck has a lot of options. A lot of removal. Good pressure, and that's why it's just so good. Alright, so we've been praising Ruby Amethyst through the roof, as we should. It's a delightful deck to play. It's very powerful, gives you a lot of option, a lot of advantage in terms of strong characters, card advantage. I've already discussed it. It's disgustingly good. So how do we combat such a deck? Well, let's look for trends. One of the trends I've already mentioned a little earlier in the video. Most of the characters have 3 willpower. In particular, Mini has 1 power, 3 willpower. So between the Minis and the Olaf, there's a lot of fairly weak characters in terms of power, all with 3 willpower. Madame Mim, 3 willpower, which is one of the key removal spells. So one of the things that you want to be careful about is not get blown out by Madame Mim. So getting a Madame Mim, bounce something, Madame Mim slams into one of your characters and lives. That's about the worst case scenario. And that can be mitigated by playing 3 power characters, by playing 3 damage removal spells. Like Smash, just deal 3 damage to anything, deals very cleanly with Mana Min, deals very clearly with the Stylish Surfer Mini Mouse, just an awesome removal spell for the simple cost of 3. Another card that's gaining traction is Jafar Royal Vizier. As a 3/2 for 2, he has enough power to resist Madame Min, or at least trade with her, take out those pesky 1-drops, and with his ability, he can actually challenge and survive against a Minnie Mouse Surfer, all for the cheap cost of 2. Now you're gonna say, well, we're playing Teeth and Ambition to deal with pesky cards like that. Yeah, that's right, but Teeth and Ambition is not Let the Storm Rage On. It doesn't replace itself. You play it, you've spent a 2-drop to deal with a 2-drop. And you've had to damage one of your own characters. So, I'm fine with that trade and forcing you to spend your 2 ink on taking out my 2 inked Jafar, who also plays well with the Dreadnought, which is a super powerful card. But that's besides the point for now. Another thing to notice is the removal of Ruby Amethyst is mostly combat based early on. So you're playing the Manaman Fox and the Maui, and that's the only removal you've got in turns 1 to 5, outside of Teeth and Ambition. So for these bigger threats, you're mostly on combat-based removal, until you hit Lady Tremaine and Be Prepared. But that leaves an opportunity for opposing decks to play some very significant threats early on. Remember this one? Stitch Rockstar on turn 4? Well, I'm sorry, but Ruby Amethyst can't do a thing against a shifted Stitch, except take out the small Stitch with the Teeth and Ambition. But outside of that, there's nothing they can do to stop a Stitch Rockstar on turn 4, especially on the play. You still have 3 turns before a potential Be Prepared from your opponent, and you can generate huge card advantage and just take over the game with your Rockstar and put Ruby Amethyst on the back foot. While the deck is playing some of these shenanigans early on with the Madame Mins bouncing back your 1-drops, the deck also has the weakness of playing those high-costed uninkables. And they need to get these draw spells in order to make these work. So the deck has a bit of a liability to early discard. So Prince John style synergies are pretty good against Ruby Amethyst because, well, Ruby Amethyst doesn't have a good way to deal with them until later and doesn't apply a ton of pressure early on. If you look, in the turns 1 and 2, the deck aims at playing a 1-drop, maybe playing a Snake, maybe a Teeth and Ambition. That's not an impressive board presence. So you have some time to do stuff. The same thing applies to ramping. You have some time to ramp, and Sapphire decks can leverage this time to get ahead in ink and try and get some advantage some other way. Maybe some Flaversham to get the card advantage on par with Ruby Amethyst. But that's another way that we can counterplay the Ruby Amethyst strategy. We can also just directly go over the top of this deck, and that's often what happens when there's a control deck that's dominant. There comes a bigger fish that tries to eat it. A control deck that's even more control-ish. So if you look at my list, I'm playing 2 Ursulas and 1 Elsa. Well, maybe you play another Elsa. Maybe you play an extra Ursula. You start cutting into the 1-drops. You start cutting into the Teeth and Ambition. You make your deck a little bit slower, but a little bit stronger in late game so that you can overtake the existing Ruby Amethyst. And you can do that with other inks. There's other very powerful top-end cards that can compete with the top end of Ruby Amethyst. And you can kind of invest more into that late game, making yourself more vulnerable to the aggressive strategies. But if they all get pushed out by Ruby Amethyst, you might have found a metagame breaker. In terms of mirror breaker cards, one of those that has shown up is Fidget, which seems a little like a very odd choice to play in a big bad Ruby Amethyst deck. It's 3/2 evasive and only quest for 1, which is shameful compared to the small mini Stylish Surfer. But it can deal with the Stylish Surfer quite effectively. Being evasive itself, it kind of acts in the same way as Jafar, as you can challenge and take out the mini Stylish Surfer and still keep your evasive. Maybe it's you still keep your fidget, whether you want to use it for combat, for questing, or for a bit of both. Back to the main list. Another thing that we can look at is that this deck has no item control whatsoever. No way to deal with them. Be Prepared doesn't target them, Elsa doesn't exert them, Lady Tremaine just doesn't have anything to do with items. So if you want to set up one of these Tamatoa combos, your items are going to stay in play. The Ruby Amethyst doesn't have any ways to counterplay the items, or you can keep some of the items like lanterns and use them as ramps safely against this deck. I didn't look into too much details into what you can do with items, but Ruby Amethyst has no way to counter them. So there's another area that we can look in terms of exploiting weaknesses of this deck. And finally, if we look at what this deck can remove, we've talked a lot about dealing 2 and the fact that the characters have 3 toughness, and so we want to be able to deal 3 damage. But what about the flip side? What is this deck trying to deal in terms of damage? Well, in terms of combat, there's Mr. Crab here that gives +3, typically to the 1-drops, hits for 4. There's Titan Ambition, hits for 2. Madam Fox hits for 4. So there's 2 + 2, 4. There's a 3 + 1, 4. There's Madam Min 4. There's Goat for 4. The deck likes to hit for 4 in terms of removal. And then it hits Maui in the top end of the curve. But that means that if we can find a nice 5 willpower character early on, then it's very hard for Ruby Amethyst to deal with it. For example, we have Maleficent Uninvited, the 3/6 questing for 3, just a very solid character that's hard to remove by Ruby Amethyst outside of a Maui. And also she has the 3 power, which can deal with a lot of their threats. So it's a nice card where, even though it's vanilla, the stats line up just perfectly to be a big pain for Ruby Amethyst. So analyzing the deck and looking at the structure of the cards, what is mostly played, how do you deal with them, is important to try and find some nice counterplay. And that's my analysis of Ruby Amethyst and its weaknesses, its strength, why it blends so well together, and how we can try to attack the deck in the metagame and try to find a winning strategy against it. Let me know in the comments below if you like this style of video, if you like deep dive analysis, just looking at the cards, talking about counterplay strategies and synergies, or if you prefer gameplay videos, or if you want a mix of both. I'm mostly looking to gauge interest into these deep dive analysis into the metagame and trying to kind of start brewing some ideas on how to challenge these decks. How do we deal with them? Again, give the video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.